sometimes we underestimate the audience's ability to story read. We always talk about like the good storytelling. It's like, I think all of us have a capacity to story read and actually also to tell. And I wish more of storytelling in our cultures.
Welcome to the Regeneration Will Be Funded. I'm your host, Matthew Monahan, and in this series, we're having conversations about regenerative finance, technology, and our living planet. How can we build an economy that's in service to life? Brought to you by Ma Earth. You can find all of our conversations at maearth.com. Thanks for joining us. Welcome. Today's guest is Susanne Aichele, co-steward of Mothertree Labs and an organizer on the Ecoweaving gathering, where we hosted several conversations in season 1. In this conversation, Susanne reflects on the power of narratives and asks, how do we weave stories of belonging? Let's dive right in with Susanne Aichele. We are here today with Susanne Aichele. She is the co-steward of Mothertree Labs. Thank you so much, Susanne, for doing this.
Thank you, Matthew.
And so starting with Mothertree Labs, I know it's not easy to summarize, which is part of its magic, but what is Mothertree Labs and what is some of the work you're doing?
Mothertree Labs is a space of research and gatherings and figuring that was initiated by Tony Lai and myself. You've had the pleasure of of his musings in the first episode, and really it moves in a place of a lot of figuring that we are doing, that we have to do. And Tony coming from a legal engineering and technology space, but also a full human, but as a sort of like the knowledge or the lens that he brings, and me from a storytelling, filmmaking, story engineering space, we realized that there actually are some important pieces that we are holding there, and some of them are to look at what the systems are in place and what parts do we, if we pry them apart, like which parts would want to be taken, forward, and or how do we even do this, like reshuffling, and really importantly, that the conversations that are happening should be happening together and should be bridged, and I think through our us being in a lot of communities and having a very broad range of interests as well, we've been able to connect some dots in people's thinking and to create spaces through the gathering that was at Wilbur.
Can you speak to that? So you and Tony have come together, you're weaving together, and we did a number of interviews at the Ecoweaving gathering, which I guess has been one of the signature offerings, if you will, of Mothertree Labs. What was Ecoweaving and what is that work?
Actually, the Ecoweaving was closely linked to the first gathering that we had at Wilbur a couple of years ago, which actually started with a story. It started with a book. That has inspired a lot of people who are in the policy technology space, and actually taking that book as a sort of stepping off ground of like, how could we make this world happen? And then it went into sort of ideation and had a specific, I think, like a currency, like a nature-based currency focus. But as we spoke to more people and brought more knowings and ways of looking at nature and like connectivity and ecology in its widest sense, we realized we also wanted to, rather than like condensing the conversation towards just currency, we actually realized that this is a space where we can broaden it and look at, yes, the protocols and all the things that people are working on, but also the connective tissue and the, people who are with the land and have their hands in it, and people who work on the sort of like research more abstract space. And these conversations, and not just conversations, but being together. I mean, there's just nothing like cooking with each other and, and I don't know, sharing a joke or going for a hike and also having difficult conversations, So Ecoweaving is a I would say more of a practice that we want to develop and nourish and also not own, but hope to be sort of like, putting out there and seeing a network weaving where we realize that this is not just about, it's not just about like these silos and the technology here and this policy here and all of this, but it's about everything. And to what extent we can bring all of us to spaces where we feel inspired and safe, and also can have look at the difficult, paradoxical aspects together.
And that book you referenced, of course, is Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson. And I know a big through line of your work is around story and restoring and unstoring. Can you share more about that?
Yeah. With the realization that we are living through a time of big transformation, and not just superficial as I would hope, but really digging deep and looking at parts. And a lot of reconnecting that has to happen after. And so Tony and I, although we come from different fields, both realized that the legal structures and the storytelling structures actually hold some key components, and to understand them, to look at them, and to actually see which of those we want to take into the future. So it's like, it sounds a bit harsh, but story engineering would probably be the sort of overarching where I look at it. But really, it's about bridging between conversations. We both realized within our fields, and then going and moving forward in the communities that we are engaging with, that all the conversations need to connect. And so on a sort of long, like the kind of day-to-day and big flowing task is to know what people are doing and what they're talking about, and connecting them and asking questions and really seeing where there's opportunities. And then increasingly, I think this year, with the Wilbur gathering that you also were at, our conversations deepen. So, we have people attending who are, on the technical engineering side, regenerative protocols. A lot of skills come together, but really the humans coming together, and to bring not just their skills, but actually more and more of all of them has really become the most joyful and important aspect. Specifically, I've always been interested in psychology, just because I think I wanted to make sense of the things happening in my life, etc. And maybe that brought me also into filmmaking. Having a I'd say you call it maybe empathy or a curiosity for people's perspectives, and rather than going in with judgment, going in with I wonder where this person comes from, and I wonder how they could also become curious about other perspectives. And the reason I think it's important is because by the time we're adults, we are often so tied up with an identity that is tied to our career, maybe our story, our identity that can be around nation or like a tribe in the sense of your work area. And if we stay in those silos and if we cling on to these identities, then how are we going to reconnect? And regeneration for me is really not just out there in nature and in the forest, but if we're going to sustain this, if we really are building or re-nourishing worlds where the humans, feel actually connected to each other and have a sense of belonging that is not just wrapped up in an identity that might be serving an old system, then, I think there's a lot of untangling and reweaving to be done. And for many years, so I've worked in TV and in film. I've been curious about what the next story is for many, many years. and I wrote a couple of sci-fi films as one of the routes of exploring that. I've worked with NGOs specifically around climate in their communication and storytelling. And so this idea of like what the next story is drove me, but there was also something that just didn't feel right about it. And so in recent years, especially pausing during lockdown, I looked at what is actually driving me, or like what are these, what makes me not totally believe in this story that, we might be weaving. And I think it's because why are we telling a story again top down? Like what are we, is our imagination even able to really stretch to that? Is my imagination able to stretch to it? So really taking like a pause to just look at what the meta story is, and having had the opportunity to meet so many people who are of different ways of knowing as well, and also realizing that rather than writing sci-fi, I'm living. We are living in what I guess is a sci-fi premises, which is, it's happening. We're doing things, and we are, and it's not streamlined. And if we're imposing one story from the top, then we'll end up in a very similar paradigm again. And yeah.
How would you describe what story you feel like is being, like, what is that next story that people are trying to point to that maybe you're looking at going, that doesn't quite feel right?
Something that comes up is, so with the Global Goals, I worked with them as a creative director for a few years, and and I had a lot of open space. I think there was a lot of trust in me figuring, and I found us sort of oscillating between urgency and hope, and so I did some reading. I'm not an expert at any of these things, but I think as a quite intuitive person, I did feel like some aspects just didn't sit with me. So hope is, I think, like not devaluing it, but hope also. What is it flattening? So Cristina Figueroa speaks of like hope as a choice, and I actually think that is a really important point. But also, what is hope putting away? When we put the light onto that, and then there is the urgency, and that's been tried for like decades now. And again, it's, as a statement, it's important. I think it's an important part of the conversation, but it paralyzes people. It paralyzes me, and it. If we're asking people to act out of morality, I don't know that we can sustain that. I think again, urgency feeds into the fear factor. Our adrenaline is up. We feel even more disconnected and hopeless. And I think this is where we're seeing a lot of disconnect from people with the subject, because there's been a lot of triggering done. So again, I'm not saying that either of them is wrong. I just feel the complexity. Complex stories are, I feel, is what is continuously needed. And in filmmaking and in story writing, there is this concept called the hero story. And I'm just going to kind of summarize, but I think you don't have to be a scriptwriter to understand it, because many of us have grown up with it. And this was in the 70s, I think it's 70s, a book came out which was claiming to have studied, most of the stories in the world throughout history, and said there is one recipe of storytelling that you will see, like a formula that you will see throughout. And again, it's not completely wrong, but it was skewing things a little bit, and film schools and writing schools went with it. And the reason that's important is because this formula speaks of the one hero, the individual, who is given, who's kind of called into an adventure to find the elixir, and they develop their special skills. And yes, they're going, it's not just linear, but in some sense there is the idea that there's someone who's going to go and save us. And like, I've believed it for such a long time. I saw that as when I'm writing a film, it's like, that's taking all the points. And then I realized beyond how that's affecting us, how it's affecting how I narrate my own life, how the hope that someone's going to save us is so strong there, that when we are feeling helpless and powerless and have no agency, then this is where we kind of cling on to. And And there's this booklet, this essay by Ursula Le Guin, and she looked at that in a really inspiring way. And she calls it the carrier bag theory of fiction, because she also felt that the hero story doesn't apply to the way that she experiences life. And if we look at this concept that, man's first tool was wielding a stick and, kill the next one. It's just like, it's always about the exciting things and out there. And she, she explores how actually the first tool would have been the gathering bag, the satchel, something to gather stories in. And so she takes that metaphor further, and it just feels so right. So I've been looking into how we tell stories collectively, how we as a community, as a family, as also even as a person with many parts, can add many voices and perspectives into narration. Now, it's not maybe the it's the Hollywood formula that will ever maybe be sellable, but I do think, just to stay with TV for 1 more second, is I think there's a reason why like long form scripted serials have become so popular, and I do think people love complexity and character, and they love the journeys. And sometimes we underestimate the audience's ability to story read. We always talk about like the good storytelling. It's like, I think all of us have a capacity to story read, and actually also to tell. And I wish more of storytelling in our cultures, of everyone, not just the select few.
Right. Okay. So what I hear you saying is that you're witnessing that we have a tendency, maybe call it in the climate regenerative kind of space, to focus on maybe hope and urgency as our mantles of storytelling. And hope can kind of sometimes flatten other things that need to be appreciated. And urgency can actually lead to sometimes a degree of hopelessness or helplessness, and be overwhelming for people. But when we look at what, other storytelling devices have been handed to us by culture and, media and Hollywood and so forth, it tends to be hero's journey, individualistic, maybe something that also doesn't quite get to what we need in this moment. And as an antidote to all that, what I'm hearing you, say is that complexity is one through line that we need. Did I do fair characterization of that? And what are some of those other things that you're feeling and sensing into as a different story or a new story, or aspects of the new story that are really drawing you?
That was beautiful. It's always nice to hear it through someone else's filter. I think the authenticity really came when I looked deep inside. I think you can study stories and structures, and I'm really interested in mythologies. I also think that we carry a very complex universe inside that holds many stories, and I think this is where we can become more familiar and maybe comfortable with complexity, paradoxes. There is, and I think that happens for me currently a lot at gatherings, and allowing several perspectives and ways of expressing to be heard and inspire each other into a place of vulnerability. So what happens with with this sort of paradigm of like there's hope and then there's solutions, etc. So once we flatten it, I think the mind always wants to like have the ending or the and how do we stay with the trouble and actually acknowledge that it can't be resolved. And so maybe it is staying with different parts and holding all of them. It's almost like it's a different posture, isn't it? But I've found that I love finding interesting questions. And I mean like really like questions that inspire me. It's like, what is your relationship to your mother's maiden name, for example? And it's remarkable how questions can bring out stories. What has been an important chair in your life? that's sort of what I'm starting to see is that people, once we are reminded that we actually have a lot of stories in us, we can realize that we actually might be more connected across time and objects. And what is a tree that has meant a lot to you? It's a sort of stories as a way of belonging, as kind of strands that are really linking you in, so that it is not this project that's happening out there, but this like we're weaving with stories, we're weaving ourselves into this ever-evolving net and web. And so maybe there isn't this one story, and actually I would say there shouldn't be, I feel, I don't know if someone's mentioned the pluriverse, sort of like the concept of the pluriverse, but this is something that has spoken to me a lot over the last year, is one of the realizations that we tend to trade and think in universals, with all the achievements of science, there has been an sort of eradication, or like often a one truth that has been followed, and a lot of cruelty has happened on the back of that. And one of them is that this truth is at the cost of other ways of knowing, and so that universality, which I'm still finding myself unpicking. If we are aiming towards one story, one utopia, then that's what we are doing. We are assuming that we know what is good for people who know what is good in their context. We talk about locality. I mean, what is true for one land, regeneration is not true for another. And I think this is also true for us. So we're like mini story hubs, and and that's going to keep continuing. And I know that might not be helpful for people who, at a level of political convincing or buy-ins, or need a story, and I do think that there is a trickling up sort of value in that one. But I feel like the moment we do that, and we flatten our aim into a mission statement, and this is what the board is going to hold us to, and if not, we're out. It feels like a dangerous road to go down.
Yeah, it really resonates with me and my experience this year doing these conversations, where I go from a conversation that someone has a very persuasive, heartfelt, compelling kind of articulation of why we shouldn't financialize, nature in some specific way, and then I go to another conversation and someone's tinkering with, forward financing for carbon markets and doing really amazing work on that, and I'm left with this paradoxical sense of like, wait, that's good, wait, that feels right, and how do I sit with those paradoxes and allow for nuance and complexity to emerge, and not be dogmatic, because contexts in different places and people's experiences are different, and I think that's also very much matches the story of how do we live with our landscapes in greater harmony. Like, what works in Washington, D.C. is not the same as rural New Zealand. Like, they're just different contexts. And so, yeah, like creating space in our stories, and I love what you said about stories as a way of belonging. Creating space for that pluriverse, that plurality of contexts and truths to emerge, does feel to me resonant with the kind of future that we're moving into, and that is part of humanity's thriving on this planet. Any reflections on all of that or responses?
Yeah, thank you. I am picking up on your experience with two people talking about their projects. Reminds me of actually one of the what feels important and also beautiful to have witnessed is that in gatherings like the Ecoweaving, and we've been to many more, that it's not like we are completely inventing a new economy at this moment, right? There is a kind of like an intersection. So, but these are a lot of people who are looking at shifts, but we're still intersecting, and we will need to sell certain, we are building products, and there is a mechanism where you have a team and you make it work or not, So I just want to say that it's I want to acknowledge that this is that some of this can only be theoretic at this place, but But what brings me a lot of joy is to see that people who would have in the past seen themselves as competitors are sitting in the same room, and really the intention throughout is to hold off on the solicitation, some people will say, but like really sharing the ideas, and I can imagine that's hard sometimes, and it's but this is really about finding joint ways or learning from each other, because reminding ourselves that the aim is very similar, I would say, which is people, like incredible people, big hearts, and I think having a space where they can be just kind of pause on that side, on the incredible hard work of finding the finances and developing, making things work. So that's sort of part of what we're doing with Ecoweaving. I think in terms of stories, it might make sense to go back to a realization I had about my childhood, which is that when I was 7, I experienced moving from one story to another. And I'm saying this because for me, story is not just something that lives in an artistic medium or a book. It's very, like, our worldviews are very real. And so I had this experience where I was born in East Germany. That was my reality, right? But it was like a very different story. And then I didn't know, but I came back from school, the wall was still up and everything was packed and we went on a train. So I woke up in a place, we're going on an adventure. But so I woke up in a place where people spoke the same language, but everything was just ever so slightly different. And I think as a child, you just cope, you sort of go, it's like your childhood is normal in some way. But then when you look back, you're like, wow, these are people who through historic circumstances were sort of put into two narratives and very much at the forefront of where they played out. And so there I was, and I'm just noticing there was a much more of a gendered expression. There was like girls' toys and boys' toys, and girls didn't want to be engineers, and there were like different logics. And whilst I was trying to adapt to them, I think there was like a sort of like a parallel process of seeing that how impactful stories are, and that they are just stories, but also not just. And what happened is my dad, who grew up in the East, he went back. He actually went back. He left. And people couldn't understand that. And I was just so curious about that for a long, long, long time, until I realized that his identity was wrapped up with that old story. And even though, the wall came down, everyone said, we won, they must have felt really, really cruel, because his friends, his life. So the reason I mention that is because when we talk about this future and building a future, it seems really important to me to understand how much of our identity is wrapped up in this current world. And even if it feels like things are kind of prying apart, I mean, you see how people want answers and stories, and sometimes some of them are very, very simplified.
Yep.
But I think this is important, because if we don't acknowledge that, and if we launch people into this idea that we're having, there'll be a lot of lostness, and I think there'll be much more space for people to be pulled into other ways of belonging. So and this doesn't happen with one campaign or one. I really think this will happen person to person, family to family.
Yeah, the way I hear that and think about that is especially like where we have, let's say, for example, phasing out fossil fuels, and finding what is that space for this enormous amount of human energy, identity, contexts, livelihoods wrapped up in the infrastructure that currently provides the basis of how human activity on the planet, operates. And how do we give space and recognition and acknowledgement whilst still, being very truthful about the changes that are required in this time that we're in, but finding what those pathways are for those identities and those contexts to still thrive. Because in the absence of that, what do we expect is going to happen, right? And that's just one example of, when you have institutional sunsetting in many different, cases that we currently are seeing around the planet, we need to somehow create those pathways and to hold that part of the story as well. I don't know if that resonates with you. I'm curious what you think.
Gosh, it just reminds me of. I can imagine how frustrating even this thought is for people who know of the urgency and they know the data. But yes, it's the systems that need to change and they need to change fast. People, they're entangled. Everything is entangled, right? There is and to just say, that they will be pushed away, a lot unravels with that. And then there's history, and there is a potential colonial aspect to it as well. To have all these we know better attitudes. So it's a complexity I can't really speak to, but I do also feel that having an awareness of holding the complexity and holding the paradoxes and acknowledging them. And in fact, something I would love to see more in our communication when we speak, for example, like biodiversity credits. I'll use it as an example. I think already like the story in there is really rich and important, and it is to finance the living world. But then there's a process that happens in this where we are now finding ways to make the living world, biodiversity, legible to the market. And a lot of people I speak to can see also what the problem there could be, which is, if you're pushing it all the way into the market and you again, you have data points and it's very difficult, or I don't know how it's possible to then pause and say, okay, now we've established a kind of like a financing that can make that sustainable. Now let's change the system. So I would love to see more honesty in the communication of the awareness of the complexity that is there, which is, are we also moving towards a literacy towards biodiversity? Because it's not just data points, right? It is relationality. It's a lot. It's all the immeasurable things. Like we are dealing with so many immeasurable relational dynamics, and I would love to speak of that more. And it's almost odd. Like it seems to sit on such a different side of the data scientific kind of numbers. But I feel it's important to for us to, even if it's in person or then when we are putting them out there, to say we acknowledge that this is complex. I guess it requires a sort of vulnerability, and I'm using this word like it's something I've only discovered in myself in the last 3 years. So I've been through like a kind of journey into like understanding what vulnerability actually is, but now I can see the strength of it, of saying, of not hiding, because we have so many people who really like the intention is so good. And I think there is still a tendency to have to get people to buy in. And so I think to develop a culture, way of talking, a way of communicating, which is, this is the best we can do right this moment. And we know it's complex, without that seeming like you don't know what you're doing. So somewhere there, and this, this is, it's a big cultural shift. I mean, we certainly don't see that in politics the way it's sort of done. Where again things are simplified and promises are made. And but I think I do think people understand, because they see how it doesn't work, and they see how it's the narrative of like 100% this and then that. This back and forth. Like, what's there in the middle? And I think that's where we can find belonging in this complexity.
Yeah, I mean, Charles Eisenstein has that beautiful framing of the space between stories, which I really resonate with. And I also am seeing the 3 horizons framework used increasingly in different circles where, we recognize that we're in, call it Horizon 1, and, a lot of change might need to happen in Horizon 2, but it's still more of a transitional phase to where we really want to go in Horizon 3, and just bringing awareness to the distinctions so that we don't kind of miss one another in the communication of, well, where are we trying to go, but how do we transition there? And I think about that in the context of the the new projects that we're funding, and like what are the incentive structures. I heard a quote the other day that the business model is the destiny. And so like if you fund, if you bring a bunch of venture capital financing at the beginning stages, you're kind of baking somewhat of the destiny of what those incentives are going to be 10, 15, 20 years down the line. I think the same is true in blockchain. We're trying to create these kind of immutable, uncensorable, distributed incentive coordination mechanisms. But okay, what is that Horizon 3 world that we want to create, and what are we baking in now? And yeah, just like more awareness of that complexity and the nuance, I think is really a critical point. I hear you bringing in vulnerability as part of maybe an ingredient of how we hold that. Can you share more? And what does that look like in practice?
The word humility also comes up, and I'm trying to see which one. I guess humility is an acknowledgement that you do not know everything, and vulnerability is to share the sides that might not be lovable or have been in your childhood context been expressed as unacceptable. So I guess they do both connect, but I'm just going to pick up on the Horizons model, which I'm not super familiar with, but it does make me think. It resonates in that I think we cannot potentially know what the horizon will shift towards as we are doing this, because the way that where the technology is right now and who is developing it, and there's a lot of talk of sovereignty and really actually putting power and decision making power into people's hands. But if we're theorizing it and already going to the place where that's happened and we think that's going to look like, so I think the humility to say this is where we're going to get it to, and then we're going to see, because once you throw, humans are messy, wonderfully messy, like in the way that the forest is messy and beautiful and interconnected. But we this is where I think like the moment we put a whole framework around and we move towards that, then we are limiting what the potential is, right? So yes, having some sort of like the humility and like a language around like, okay, this is where we're going to pause and review and acknowledge and take back our agenda. And this is so difficult, right? Because we are, as I said, like people are depending economically, etc. But there must be a way where there can be an industry-wide, because the industry is building itself, right? Like a way of saying, let's review and actually really take on board what is working or not. And why I bring up vulnerability, I think if we are, we're building friendships as we work and as we discover, I think like calling it work, I mean, this is our calling vocation. And because it is still this weird mix, I do think we still have a tendency to hide from each other. And that's fine, because it requires a really safe space to feel like you can share. And so I don't think that should be rushed. At the same time, if we don't create a space to be vulnerable and for people to express their different perspectives, and some people are also much better at expressing themselves than others, so that also requires a pausing and hearing ways in which we haven't heard. And it's a very rewarding journey that I will never stop being on. So it's not as if I've got it figured out, but it's really difficult, And I think these days we are asked, I think the whole idea of self-improvement, etc., as if we're a leaky house. I think there's an aspect to it where I'm incredibly grateful. It has helped me as a starting point. But I feel like we're sort of asked to do this healing work in isolation. And again, like we become our own hero in our hero story. And what happened in my case is that I spent like a good, like 9 months by myself in lockdown, doing like really, work had paused. So I was just like really going in. And then I moved into a community where I was like, amazing, I've got it figured out. And then you apply, you're like literally around people that you don't, like constantly like have little friction points. And I realized I hadn't figured it out. And I realized that only in the practice and only when I was able to say, actually, what you just said really upset me. I'm not going to hold it together, but so we're not constantly like being reactive with each other. And I think the vulnerability comes with, hey, I've just said something. I was actually upset, but I'm really sorry because it wasn't about you. This was about something that I realized. So this kind of like self-knowledge will help us to navigate the complexity and the paradoxes. And I think a lot of compassion will be required. And again, not everyone is working at the same speed. And I've found it incredibly inspiring when other people were being vulnerable, and I admire them. So I'm like, yeah, more of that. So yeah, I think in this I said like the new story and the next story, but I think that there's like a unstorying process, and the unstorying requires a little bit of that dissolvement of the parts of your identity that are attached to being an expert at something, because we've put so much energy in it, What gives me hope, a lot of hope, is every time I am in the presence of a human child. And I am reminded that before we are socialized, we know, like, we have such a tendency to relationality, be it with other humans or non-humans. We see the aliveness or the potential in, the animism in the world, and a deep care. And so I know that we've experienced it, and it's something that I think we can tap into. And it's a big ask because, I think the process of being socialized and having to be good at something in all the ways that it comes, and having to hide, like having to hide away the part in you that has lots of questions, and they might be silly. To undo that is really disorienting and difficult. But I do feel that if we can kind of go into, and who said the other day, like, we're not inadequate adults, we're inadequate children. So to reconnect to that person that you were, and be okay with that, and doesn't mean that you're regressing, but it actually means that you are giving yourself more capacity to actually connect in the way that we are connected, that we are part of nature.
And within the context of the eco-weaving gatherings and other, weaving that you're doing, are there particular practices that you're intentionally bringing in to draw out some of these different qualities and parts? Or can you share any more about your thinking of these new ways to weave at events and gatherings?
Yeah, we've it's something actually I'm really excited about. Seeing last spring, I think we had people with us who very graciously brought their spiritual selves with to, and I think it requires a sort of energetic gravitas, because many of us, including myself, find spirituality maybe as a concept quite intimidating. It's something, again, like I need to know and I have to do it right, But to actually, I think the invitation really was to take moments to do embodied, like an opening circle where we actually step back and acknowledge everyone who isn't here, not because we didn't just invite them or they can't afford it, but does it feel safe? To actually acknowledge that. That this might not be a safe place for everyone yet, and the different ways of knowing, and then also taking another step back and acknowledging the non-human entities that actually are entities, beings that we are talking about here, right? So this is and when you do that by yourself, it feels like very overwhelming. When you do that as a group, and you all watch each other do this weird thing, and I think we need a lot of weird things, but doing them together is incredibly moving. And I've just took note of people saying thank you so much, and this is like they directed it at me, I guess, because we're the stewards, but really thanking to the people there who were holding a tea ceremony whilst a hacking like an ideation area was happening, and holding the heart space, and I think these sometimes seem so disconnected, but actually there was just something where people could join or kind of go into the more spiritual and maybe story side to the extent that they feel comfortable, but just having it present there. And I would love to, and we'll continue to build on that. Something that Tony and I will want to add to the sort of morning and evening, like the sessions that you do during the day, is an intentional time, thinking like 10, 15 minutes, where the group is really invited to pause and to look at what's been discussed and what's being proposed, and look at all the ways that all the kind of get curious about the externalities that might not have been considered, and who might not be included in this proposal, or can we pause and actually, is there a mechanism to, as we were just saying, to see it as a several step? Because again, my personal experience of having done, I guess you would call it like decolonial work, a kind of like an unscripting or an awareness of the house that modernity built. And there's some wonderful groups and references and books, but it feels very different doing that by yourself and holding the shame and the guilt and everything that comes. And that is important to move through. But when you do it as a group together and you move away from finger pointing and from the blame game, and this, and you get curious together, and there will be someone in the room who has an awareness of, a more, I don't know, use neurodivergent, but different ways of looking at something and reading it, and a non-English perspective, and so this, I think that as a practice, to have like, I mean, brainstorm is a concept now, right? Like that, but it's sort of like the pausing and it's like detective work. You can actually get really, it can be, it's almost like we can get creative about this unstorying, restorying process. And if we do it together, then it doesn't just feel like I'm going a bit mad. It feels like we are together creating new realities. And this is how, I guess this is how, groups have an incredible power to do that.
Nice.
And getting everyone involved is also important. So again, I love coming up with these, and we intend also to hold a longer term residency next year, like a 6-week, where specifically we're going to be, like an art research, interbeing sort of residency, where we will be really bringing this intention and these experiments and work with them and see what we can kind of share.
Beautiful. I'm curious too. I know you're a student of Bayo Akomolafe's work and taking his course right now. I'm curious what you're learning in those spaces and observing.
He's been, he's the non-guru. He's the non-guru that just expresses himself really well. And when it comes to vulnerability, like strong expressions and vulnerability with a trickster, he can hold a lot of these paradoxes in a person. And it's unscripted. What his expressions are resonating with me. So maybe less going into the teaching, but he really has expanded my thinking around the logic that I find myself operating in. So I said that as I was looking at like this story and that story, and what is the alternative to the hero story. I think listening to him and as an invitation to actually pause and think, what are the words I'm using and what are the logics that are attached to it? And actually, by opposing something, I am feeding it. I'm feeding its logic. And so where are we, which are the areas where we can actually find other truths, and for him, they're often the ones illegible by capitalism, and I have actually experienced how grief is it's a really interesting place where it hurts and it takes you, swishes you around, and you think you're going to go through 7 steps, but actually it's like it's got its own plan. And for me, grief has actually become a really interesting experience of how the world is worlding me, and if I allow it to happen, it's a very empowering, and again, it's a good one where it happens differently for everyone. adds a richness and a strange sort of belonging to something which is not part of this sort of paradigm. So, and his play with words, which is something that Tony and I also love. But it's and Donna Haraway, who I've referenced earlier, in her Staying with the Trouble. There is like an acknowledgement that there is a lot of joy, and the gatherings that I've been part of, there's incredible. There's like tears and laughter and pauses and ridiculousness and all of it, like the full spectrum. And so seeing that and it's encouraging me to really bring all my ideas and spectrum and, who are my elders, that I would love to sit in a room and hear each other and then, we might dance and then we might, do a whiteboard session and all that. So, maybe the kind of unsiloing has sort of like been extrapolated, like has kind of been heightened through witnessing the way that he approaches this.
Nice. Well, I really resonate with so much of what you shared, Susanne. I think that this approach of humility and vulnerability, sitting with the trouble and sitting with the paradox, those things to me feel like such important medicine of our time and for the stories that we weave. Very grateful for the work you're doing with Mothertree Labs and Ecoweaving. Are there any other threads or closing comments that you'd like to share?
It's something I'm still getting used to because although the words you've just mentioned can bring up sort of a little bit, it's a bit heavy. It's a bit, I think we have a lot of associations when it comes to it. Like, oh, is this about therapy? And what I'm really experiencing as I'm unfurling into this space myself is there is a lot of joy in it. There's a lot of, a lot of emotions, and I think that it seems so important to me that we, whilst we have to sit with a lot of complexity and difficult, and this is life is involved here, and I think the joy aspect, I want to hold that one in this conversation as well, because when we reconnect and we can experience the full range of us, including the silliness, including the getting it wrong and blushing and oh God, I just want the ground to swallow up. And then when the ground doesn't swallow you up and you're still there and people are still there, something really magical happens.
Susanne, thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, what do you think? Please leave us a comment below. You might also be interested in the conversations we had with Tony Lai, co-steward of Mothertree Labs, as well as Jessie Kate Shingler, and many others at the Ecoweaving Gathering. Links are in the show notes, and all of the conversations are available at maearth.com. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.